My name is Montel Harrington. I was 33 years old, and I believed it, truly believed it. A man who keeps his word keeps his home. Then my wife slid divorce papers across the kitchen table. A Tuesday morning in March. She was still wearing her wedding ring. She didn't even look up from her phone. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had been expecting this. Not hoping for it, not wanting it, expecting it. 8 months before that Tuesday morning, I had already prepared a folder. I had already made arrangements. I had already decided, quietly and completely, what kind of man I was going to be when this moment came. She had no idea who she was actually married to. The kitchen in our house on Delow Drive in College Park, Georgia was small. Not cramped, just honest. Yellow walls, a window over the sink that let in good morning light, a coffee maker that groaned like an old hound every single morning at 6:15, because routines were the architecture of a quiet life. And a quiet life was what I had chosen. That March morning, the light came in sideways. Atlanta can't quite make up its mind in early spring. The air still carries a chill before 8, but the sun pushes through like it has somewhere important to be. I had just poured my second cup when Bliss walked in. She was dressed for work already, hair done, red lipstick, the shade she only wore when she felt powerful. Her heels clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm I had learned to read the way farmers read weather. Not a warning, a decision already made. She set the papers on the table between us without a word. I picked them up. I read through them slowly. Not because I was surprised, because I believed a man ought to give his full attention to anything he signs. And as I read, I saw the name printed in the bottom left corner of the first page. Cole and Associates. Ethan R. Cole, Esquire. I didn't say a word, but something settled behind my sternum. Not pain exactly, more like confirmation. The kind that doesn't arrive as a surprise, but as a door finally closing on a room you've been standing outside of for a very long time. She had been planning this for months. The man whose name sat on that letterhead was the same man I had seen her text at 2 in the morning. The same man whose handwriting I had recognized on a small, folded note that once slipped out of a bouquet of gas station flowers. 2 words. No name. Meet me at 8. I had refolded that note. I said nothing. I put the flowers in the vase on the counter. That is the kind of man I am. I signed the papers, set the pen down carefully. Before I did, I held my gaze on the ring still sitting on her finger. 2 full seconds. She was still wearing it. Still wearing it while she handed me divorce papers. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that detail. I haven't found the right word for it yet. She took the papers, tucked them into her bag, and walked out without saying goodbye. The front door clicked shut. The coffee maker groaned. The morning light kept coming through the window like nothing at all had just changed. I sat there for a long moment. Then I stood, walked to the bedroom, and opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a manila folder, neat, unmarked on the front. Inside, in my own handwriting, contingency, Bliss. I had prepared it 8 months ago. I had prepared it because Noel Freeman gave me information no husband ever wants to receive. Information that every prepared man must learn to carry without letting it turn him into someone he doesn't want to be. But I'll explain that in a moment. I made 1 phone call, 3 words. Uncle Leonard, it's done. Then, activate the protocol. 7 minutes later, 2 black Escalades rolled up in front of the house on Delow Drive. A man in a dark suit stepped out. He looked at me with quiet formality. Welcome back, Mr. Harrington. I picked up my bag. I did not look back at the house. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what came first. Who Montel Harrington really was, what he had agreed to sacrifice, and why the woman who thought she was leaving a man with nothing had spent 3 years living beside one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta without ever once knowing it. Stay with me, because what Bliss never knew about the man she just handed those papers to is about to change everything you think you understand about this story. 3 years before that Tuesday morning in March, a phone call rearranged my entire life. It was Noelle Freeman. She had been my grandfather's closest assistant for 11 years. The kind of woman who knows where every document lives, who remembers every promise made in every room, who speaks in a voice so measured you always listen twice before responding. "Your grandfather is gone, Montel," she said, and he left very specific instructions. My grandfather, James Harrington Sr., had built Harrington Holdings from a single block of rental properties in southwest Atlanta into a real estate and investment corporation worth more than $10 billion. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a patient one, and his will reflected that patience directly. The terms were non-negotiable. Before I could lead the company, I had to live 3 full years as an ordinary man. No corporate access, no company accounts, no title, a modest salary, a modest address. A life that looked, from the outside, completely unremarkable. "He believed," Noelle said quietly, "that a man who has never had to choose integrity when it costs him something has never truly been tested." I agreed without hesitation. I moved to College Park. I took a job as a logistics coordinator at a regional supply company off Old National Highway. I drove a 2019 Honda Accord with a slow passenger window. I lived quietly, genuinely quietly, because I understood this wasn't a punishment. It was a preparation. I met Bliss at a neighborhood gathering in East Point about 4 months after I arrived. The kind that starts at 4 in the afternoon with somebody's uncle grilling ribs and ends past midnight with somebody's cousin arguing about football. She was smart, beautiful, and when she laughed, the whole yard felt smaller, in the best possible way. We talked for 3 hours, about growing up without much, about the kind of people we were determined to become. She found me again through mutual friends 2 weeks later, then again after that. I was drawn to her ambition, her clarity, her absolute refusal to accept a small life. What I didn't understand yet was the difference between ambition and restlessness. One builds, the other consumes. We married 14 months after we met, a quiet ceremony at Cascade United Methodist Church in southwest Atlanta. Her mother, Celestine, cried through the whole thing. My Uncle Leonard sat in the 3rd row with a smile he never once put away. The first year was good, genuinely good. The second year, the edges began to show. Bliss had taken a PR position at a firm in Buckhead, and the gap between her colleagues' lives and our life in College Park began to settle on her like something heavy. She started spending long evenings on her phone, scrolling through vacations in Santorini, condominiums in Midtown, lives that shone in ways ours did not. She would come home and look around our kitchen with eyes that weren't seeing what was there. They were measuring it against something else entirely. I brought my wife flowers one Wednesday evening, gas station flowers, because I had thought of her on the drive home, and it was already 9 o'clock. She dropped the bouquet on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and as I gathered the stems, a small, folded piece of paper slipped out and landed on the linoleum. I unfolded it. 2 words in handwriting that was not mine. "Meet me at 8. I refolded the note carefully. I put the flowers in the vase. I said nothing, but I kept it. A man who intends to act with precision keeps everything. What I didn't know in that moment, what I would only piece together much later, was that Noelle had already seen something I hadn't. Her network, The same quiet infrastructure she had maintained for my grandfather for over a decade had flagged a connection between Bliss and a young real estate attorney named Ethan Cole. 5 months before I found that note in the flowers, it started as a professional overlap. Bliss's PR firm had worked adjacent to his law office on a development project in Midtown Atlanta. But Noelle's instincts, sharpened by 11 years of watching people make consequential decisions in the orbit of significant money, told her the contact had shifted. She began keeping records, quietly, thoroughly, the way she did everything. She told me 6 months before the divorce papers arrived. That was when I created the folder, not out of anger, not out of wounded pride, out of clarity. Because I understood, with the particular hard-won understanding of a man who had agreed to be tested, that what was coming was going to require me to be very organized about who I intended to protect and how. Weeks after finding the note, I was awake at 3 in the morning when my phone lit up with a bank notification that had arrived hours earlier while I slept. Transaction: $2,800. Transferred to an external personal account, 2:17 a.m. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I lay in the dark, listening to my wife breathe beside me. The transfer didn't surprise me. It confirmed what Noelle's records had already begun to establish. I didn't ask about it in the morning, not because I was afraid of the answer, because I wasn't ready to act yet. And a man who acts before he's ready makes unnecessary mistakes. Around that same time, a discreet contact sent a brief message, factual, no commentary. She met that man again at the cafe on Peachtree Road. 5th time this month. I deleted the message. I didn't reply. I want to be honest about what those months felt like, because this part deserves honesty. I wasn't numb. There were evenings when I sat on the back steps of that little house and felt the weight of it press against my chest like something physical. Loving someone who is quietly choosing someone else is a particular kind of grief. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, layer by thin layer, until one morning you wake up and realize you've been carrying it so long it has started to feel like your own heartbeat. But I had made a decision long before any of this began. Not a decision born from stubbornness or pride, a decision about identity, about who I was going to be when the pressure arrived. And that decision had already been made. The contingency folder held everything: foundation documents for Celestine's medical expenses, Jordan's scholarship paperwork, the legal arrangements timed precisely to the end of my 3-year period, and the letter to Uncle Leonard, not a weapon, a safeguard for people who deserved protecting, regardless of what Bliss chose to do. The night she brought the papers, after the door clicked shut and the house went quiet, I sat in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes. I did not cry, but I did not move either. Then I stood to put something in the refrigerator and stopped. Bliss's day planner was sitting on the kitchen counter. She must have left it the last time she came back for her things. It had fallen open on its own, one page bent back at an angle. A date circled in red ink, 8 months earlier. A name written beside it, in her handwriting. Ethan. Midtown. Coffee. 8 months ago. 4 months before I found the note in the flowers. 3 months before the first late-night transfer. The beginning of something she had been keeping from me far longer than I understood, until this moment. I set the planner back on the counter. I picked up my phone. I called Uncle Leonard. The 2 Escalades arrived 7 minutes later. She walked out of that house believing she had left a man behind. She had no idea she had just set into motion the most important morning of her own life. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something honest. If you were Montel and you already knew everything, the affair, the late-night transfers, the attorney's name on the paperwork. Would you have signed those papers in silence and walked away with your dignity intact? Or would you have made sure she understood exactly what she was walking away from before you left? Drop a 1 if you would have walked away quietly. Drop a 2 if you would have made sure she knew. There's no wrong answer. But I promise you, what Montel did next is something most people never see coming. 1 month after I signed those divorce papers, Harrington Holdings held the official launch event for a new $150 million community investment fund, the largest private real estate development initiative in the combined history of College Park and East Point. The venue was the Fox Theater on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. Not a conference room, not a hotel ballroom, the Fox. With its Moorish arches, its grand pipe organ, chandeliers that have hung from that ceiling since 1929. The kind of room that tells you something serious is happening before a single word gets spoken. I wore a dark charcoal suit, simple, well-tailored. I had spent 3 years in logistics coordinator clothes, and I wanted this moment to feel like exactly what it was. Not a performance, a return. Noelle was backstage with me, tablet in hand, earpiece in place. She ran through the evening's program with her usual precision. Then she stopped mid-sentence and touched my arm. There's something you need to know before you walk out there. Her voice carried that particular measured quality she reserved for serious information. Ethan Cole didn't just submit a proposal for the Southeast Corridor development contract. 3 weeks ago, he reached out directly to one of the board members and implied he had a prior working relationship with you, that you had personally expressed interest in his firm. He was trying to walk into a $12 million contract on the strength of your name alone. She paused. I blocked it. The board member is fully briefed, and Ethan knows the board is now aware of what he attempted. I absorbed that for a moment. Then why is he still coming tonight? Noelle's expression didn't change. Because he still believes he has the upper hand. He came to gather material. He's already begun feeding background to 2 media contacts. In his mind, tonight is reconnaissance. I nodded once. Then let him watch. She straightened my lapel, a small, unhurried gesture that carried the weight of everything she didn't need to say aloud. Then, go be who you are. Here's something worth understanding about a man like Ethan. He wasn't reckless walking into that theater, fully knowing the board had been warned about him. He was something else. Overconfident. There's a difference. He had built his whole career on being the smartest person in the room. He had never once hit a wall he couldn't talk his way around. So when the wall started closing in, he didn't step back. He leaned in further. Started taking notes. That instinct, that refusal to ever just retreat, that was the beginning of his end. I walked onto that stage. The applause began before I even reached the podium. Not the polite kind, the kind that builds from the back of a room and rolls forward. I stood at the microphone and let it settle. For just a moment, I let myself feel the full distance between the man who had held a manila folder in a College Park kitchen 31 days ago and the man standing in this room right now. 3 years, every single day of it, had been worth it. I spoke for about 20 minutes about the fund, the communities it would serve, what my grandfather always believed. That wealth is only real when it roots itself somewhere, when it changes the ground it stands on. The room listened in that particular way rooms listen when people are genuinely present, not just attending. Then I saw her. My wife was seated in the middle section, roughly 14 rows back, in a black dress. Her posture was very still. Ethan sat beside her, slightly forward, jaw set, eyes moving through the room the way eyes move when they're cataloging instead of experiencing. My wife wasn't cataloging. She was staring at me with an expression I recognized immediately. The look of someone watching a building appear on a lot they were absolutely certain was empty. What was happening to Bliss in that moment didn't need a textbook word. Anybody who's ever been wrong about someone they loved would recognize it on sight. She had built a story in her head. Montel was ordinary. Montel had a ceiling. Montel was the kind of man you trade in once something shinier comes along. That story was falling apart right in front of her, in a theater full of strangers, with nowhere to put the wreckage. And here's the part that matters most. The signs had always been there. Every quiet act of generosity, every decision he never bragged about, every patient choice she had filed away as proof he had nothing more to offer. All of it had been pointing somewhere else entirely. She just hadn't been looking hard enough to see it. We don't only miss the truth sometimes. We get certain we've already found it. I didn't acknowledge her during the event. I finished my remarks, shook hands, took photographs with council members and foundation directors. Then, in the VIP corridor off the main lobby, marble floors, low lighting, the crowd's noise still drifting in from somewhere behind us, she found me. She had come alone. Ethan wasn't with her. She looked like a woman who had been holding herself together for the better part of an hour and was no longer entirely sure she could manage it. The red lipstick was still on, but something underneath it had gone soft. Montel, barely above a whisper. How could I not have known? I reached into my jacket pocket and handed her an envelope. She looked at it, then at me. She opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a paid-in-full notice for the mortgage on her mother's home on Delmar Lane in East Point. The second, a letter from the Harrington Family Foundation confirming a 4-year renewable scholarship in her brother Jordan's name at Georgia State University. Her hands began to tremble. Not slightly. The paper shook visibly between her fingers. Jordan mentioned a foundation grant last fall, she said, her voice gone low and strange. I told him not to get his hopes up. A long pause. I didn't know it was you. You knew, I said evenly. You just didn't believe it. Because if you had truly believed the man you were married to was capable of something like this, you wouldn't have gone through my laptop on the kitchen table 2 weeks before you handed me those papers. The color left her face completely. She hadn't told anyone about that. She had been absolutely certain I didn't know. I held her gaze a moment longer than I needed to. Something in me still remembered who she had been at that block gathering in East Point. The woman who laughed like the whole yard belonged to her. I won't pretend that memory cost me nothing, standing there in that corridor. But my choices had been made, long before this hallway, long before this evening. I did all of this before you signed the papers, I said quietly. Not after. Not to win you back. Not to make a point. Because I had already decided what kind of man I was going to be, regardless of what happened to the marriage. She had no answer. There wasn't one available. I excused myself. I had a board dinner to attend. I walked away. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps following. No voice calling my name. Just the faint murmur of the crowd still in the theater, and the quiet of a corridor, and the sound of an envelope held in 2 trembling hands. She stood in that marble hallway until it emptied around her. What she didn't yet know was that Ethan Cole had already set something in motion in the dark, and the worst of what he'd planned hadn't surfaced yet. Don't go anywhere, because what Montel found on that recording is the moment this entire story turns from heartbreak into something that will leave you absolutely speechless. Ethan Cole left the Fox Theater that night without the material he came for. He had expected to watch a modest corporate announcement, something he could reframe for his media contacts as a man overreaching, a newly minted executive without the substance to back the title. What he witnessed instead was a packed theater, a standing ovation, and the man he had dismissed as ordinary standing at the center of one of the most powerful rooms in Atlanta. He left early, and he left angry. In the days that followed, the campaign shifted from gathering intelligence to outright offense. Noel's team tracked it with quiet efficiency. 2 Atlanta media contacts receiving curated background packages. Questions seeded about the Harrington leadership transition. A particular framing of my 3-year arrangement that made it sound like avoidance instead of preparation. He wanted the story to read as a man who had been hiding, not a man who had been chosen. He was building a public narrative before a legal one could fully form. And Bliss, caught between the wreckage of what she had chosen and the humiliation of what she had lost, was feeding him details. Timelines, the name of the law firm she'd used, small domestic specifics only a wife would know. What Ethan was doing has a name, though you don't need to know the term to recognize the move. Deny everything. Attack first. Turn yourself into the victim before anyone can call you the offender. It's what cornered people do. Instead of owning what they've done, they make noise. They scatter competing stories until nobody can find the real one underneath. It usually works. It almost never works against someone who kept receipts. What Ethan didn't account for was the house on Delow Drive. I had installed a security system there 18 months into my 3-year period. 3 cameras, cloud-linked, motion-activated. The kind of setup a logistics coordinator might install for ordinary peace of mind. Or the kind a man installs when he has a clear enough sense of what's coming to know his home might one day need to speak on his behalf. About 2 weeks after the Fox Theater event, Bliss came back to the house. I learned later she had come alone at first, then called Ethan, who showed up 20 minutes after her. Whatever she'd come looking for, she stayed. And whatever Ethan came for, he brought his strategy with him. What neither of them knew was that I was already inside. I'd activated the recorder before they arrived. Ethan paced the kitchen, that same yellow-walled kitchen with the groaning coffee maker and the window that let in good morning light. His polished attorney composure had stripped down to something rawer underneath. What remained sounded less like ambition and more like fear dressed up in aggression. "We go to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution this week," he said. "I already gave my contact there background on him. They're ready to run the story. And if we need more leverage, I even have photos of Montel signing the divorce papers right here in this house. I got them from the security camera he forgot to turn off." A brief silence. Then Bliss's voice, quieter. "What security camera?" "Above the kitchen door. I checked it when we came by for your things last month. He never disconnected it. I have the footage." He was correct that I had footage from that camera. He was not correct about which direction it was pointed. The camera above the kitchen door faced inward. Every word of that conversation had been recorded with complete clarity. A man who decides someone is beneath him stops tracking that person accurately. He stops updating his understanding of who they are and what they're capable of. He makes plans based on a version of them that was never real to begin with. Ethan had looked at me and seen a logistics coordinator in a Honda Accord, a man with a modest house and no visible ceiling. He had borrowed my name to open a $12 million door and assumed I'd never be in a position to close it. He had decided what I was. And men who decide what you are, stop watching what you do. That was the most expensive mistake he ever made. I held a press conference 3 days later at the Harrington Holdings offices on Peachtree Center Avenue. 32 floors of glass and steel, the company name etched in bronze above the lobby entrance. Journalists, photographers, 2 local television crews, representatives from the Georgia Real Estate Commission, all of them present. I was brief and direct. I explained Ethan's fraudulent misuse of my name with the board member. I laid out the media campaign. Then I turned to the screen behind me and pressed play. His voice filled the room. Every word, Every instruction, every calculation, delivered in his own confident tenor from a kitchen he believed was no longer mine to protect. The room went completely still. Ethan was seated near the back. He had come believing this was a general corporate media event. When he heard himself through those speakers, he stood. His chair scraped backward across the floor. His face had gone the color of old concrete. His throat worked once. No sound came out. He moved toward the door. Two of my attorneys stepped quietly into the aisle. He turned back toward me. Whatever composure remained, he spent on volume. "Who the hell do you think you are?" I let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. Then I said, "The man you once looked down on." No one in the room laughed. No one needed to. Every person present already understood exactly what had just happened. He was escorted out. Within 48 hours, the Georgia State Bar opened a preliminary inquiry into his professional conduct. A civil lawsuit followed, from our legal team and from the board member he had misled. There's a moment some people reach, eventually, where everything lines up at once. Every choice that led them exactly to where they're standing. It doesn't creep up slow. It lands all at once, like somebody flipped a switch in a room that's been dark for years. Bliss reached that moment alone, sitting in a parking garage on Peachtree Center Avenue, watching the press conference on her phone. She'd driven there without really deciding to. Grief does that sometimes, moves your body toward something before your mind has caught up. She sat there in the dark, phone in her lap, listening to Ethan's voice come out of speakers in a room she couldn't even enter. She hadn't lost a wealthy husband. She had lost a man who knew the truth about her from the start and chose to be kind anyway. That understanding didn't leave once it landed. The civil case moved through the courts over the following months. Ethan surrendered his law license pending investigation. Bliss lost her position at the Buckhead PR firm, the firm that managed public image of all things, and her professional reputation came apart with the swift, complete thoroughness that borrowed foundations always produce. 2 days after the press conference, Bliss called Noelle and asked to meet with me privately. We met for 45 minutes at a coffee shop on Lee Street in College Park. Neutral ground. Her choice. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't make excuses. She sat across from me and said, "I need you to know that I understand what I did. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I just needed to say it to you directly." I told her I had already forgiven her. Not for her sake, for mine. Because I had learned from my grandfather that a man who carries unforgiveness carries it alone. And I had already carried enough. 7 months after the press conference, she gave a formal public apology. In her own words, unedited as I had requested. One sentence stayed with me long after I read it. She said, "I confused ambition with wisdom, and I am still learning the full cost of that mistake." The legal chapter was closing. But the real ending of this story, the moment that finally broke something open in Bliss that no courtroom had touched, was still coming. And it would arrive not in a press conference or a corridor or a coffee shop on Lee Street. It would come in her mother's voice, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Macon, Georgia. Don't move. Because what Montel chose to do after all of this, after everything she put him through, is the part of this story that will stay with you long after today is over. The legal process lasted 7 months. 7 months of depositions and scheduled motions and carefully worded statements delivered in conference rooms that smelled of recycled air and untouched coffee. 7 months of Noelle sitting across from me at the Harrington Holdings offices, working through documents with the same calm efficiency she'd brought to every task since the days when my grandfather's name was the one on the building. At the end of it, I asked for exactly one thing. Not financial damages beyond what the civil proceedings required. Not a statement drafted by Bliss's attorneys and softened into near meaninglessness by 3 rounds of revision. not a gesture managed by a publicist. I asked for a public apology. In her own words, unedited. She gave it, and I believed she meant it. After that, Bliss left Atlanta. She moved to Macon, Georgia, 85 miles south, far enough from Buckhead that the distance felt like more than geography. She found work at a small nonprofit called Second Story, running after-school literacy programs for kids in Bibb County. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment near Tatnall Square Park. She drove a used Nissan. She had stopped posting on social media entirely. From what I understood, and I wasn't actively watching, but Atlanta isn't as large as it believes itself to be. She was building something quieter, something that fit her differently than the Buckhead world ever had. I'm not in a position to say whether she had found peace, but from everything I heard, she was trying. And trying, in my experience, is where most of the real work happens. I didn't contact her. There was nothing between us that required it. The marriage had been what it had been. I had done everything I intended to do, in private, in advance, without expecting recognition. What I hadn't done, and this is the part that surprises people, was stop. Her mother, Celestine, was a small, dignified woman who had spent the better part of 4 decades on Delmar Lane in East Point, raising 3 children on a school cafeteria worker's income and a faith so practical it had no room for self-pity. She had done nothing wrong. She had welcomed me into her home, fed me from her table, and cried at our wedding because she was glad her daughter had found someone she believed was good. She was right about that. She was just wrong about what her daughter would do with it. Celestine had a chronic heart condition, ongoing medication, regular specialist visits, eventually a minor cardiac procedure. The out-of-pocket costs were significant. Her supplemental insurance covered a portion. The remainder went through a Harrington Family Foundation account that bore no name she would have recognized. She didn't know it was me. Jordan, Bliss's younger brother, 21 and finishing his 2nd year at Georgia State, had been receiving a foundation scholarship that arrived each semester under a foundation seal with one instruction: study well. He had told me once, early in my marriage to his sister, that he wanted to study urban planning, that he wanted to understand why certain neighborhoods get investment and others don't, and whether that pattern could ever change. I had thought about that conversation many times in the years that followed. His scholarship continued without interruption. This year, I had quietly expanded it to cover graduate studies too, something Bliss didn't yet know. My name appeared on no document. I want to be direct about why I kept doing this, not because it needs defending, but because I think honesty is the only currency that holds its value once everything else has been spent. I didn't keep supporting Celestine and Jordan as strategy, not to hold something over Bliss, not to set up some future revelation, not to be remembered as the bigger person in a story someone might one day tell. I did it because I had made a decision long before any of this began, a decision about who I was going to be, entirely separate from what the marriage became. And that decision had never included withdrawing care from people who never wronged me. Celestine wasn't Bliss. Jordan wasn't Bliss. Their lives, their futures, had nothing to do with what happened in a kitchen on Delow Drive on a Tuesday morning in March. A promise doesn't stop being a promise just because the person who witnessed it is no longer in the room. Noelle knew, of course. She always knew. That was one of the things that made her irreplaceable. Not just her efficiency or her memory for detail, but the quiet respect with which she held other people's choices. She processed every foundation distribution to Celestine's account without ever once asking me to explain it. One afternoon, about 4 months after Bliss's public apology, she set a file on my desk and said, without looking up from her tablet, "Jordan made Dean's List this semester." I said, "Good." She said, "He sent a thank you note to the foundation. He didn't know who to address it to." I said, "File it." She nodded. She walked back toward her office. Then she stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around, just said, quietly, to the doorframe, Your grandfather would have done the same thing. He used to say the true test of a man's character is what he does for people who can never repay him. She didn't wait for my response. She walked back to her desk. I sat there for a moment longer than I needed to. Some things don't need to be discussed. They just need to be done. And occasionally, very occasionally, they need to be acknowledged by exactly one person in exactly the right way, and then left alone. What Montel was doing in private, while the rest of Atlanta had moved on to the next headline, that was the real story all along. And the moment that finally reached Bliss, the moment that broke something open in her that no legal proceeding ever touched, was coming. Not from a courtroom, not from a press conference. It was coming in her mother's voice, on an ordinary afternoon in a small apartment near Tatnall Square Park. Stay right here, because the last piece of this story, the one Montel never told anyone, is the one that will change how you think about love, loyalty, and the quiet things a good man does when no one at all is watching. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Macon when the phone rang. Bliss was at her kitchen table, going over program materials for Second Story's Fall Reading Initiative. A stack of children's books on one side, a cold cup of tea on the other. The particular quietness of a life that's been simplified by consequence and is learning, slowly, genuinely, without any guarantee of arrival, to feel like enough. Her mother's name appeared on the screen. Celestine's voice, when it came, carried something Bliss hadn't heard in it before. Not distress, not the careful steadiness Celestine deployed during hard seasons. Something more fragile than either. The voice of a woman who just learned something that quietly rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last few years. "Sweetheart," she said. "Montel came by the house today." Bliss didn't speak. He brought paperwork for a community outreach program the foundation is running in East Point. He sat with me for a little while. We had some tea. We talked about your father, and about Jordan, how proud we both are, and about that magnolia tree in the backyard that finally started blooming again after that hard winter. Celestine paused, and in the pause, Bliss could hear the whole familiar weight of Delmar Lane. Before he left, I asked him. I had to. I said, "Montel, why are you still looking after this family after everything that happened?" A silence. He just smiled at me. You know how he smiles, like he made peace with something a long time ago, and the question doesn't cost him anything anymore. And he said, "Because I made a promise once, Mrs. C, and I'm not in the habit of breaking them." Bliss had gone completely still. The apartment was very still. Then Celestine's voice dropped lower, just above a whisper. "He told me one more thing before he walked to his car, baby. He said, I wrote it down because I knew I'd need to get it exactly right," he said. "Tell her I started paying your medical bills the same month she first met Ethan. I knew everything from the very beginning. I just chose to handle it this way." The phone was still against Bliss's ear. She could hear her mother breathing. She could hear the ambient sounds of Delmar Lane in the late afternoon, the familiar music of a life she'd grown up inside, and then spent years measuring against things she thought were better. On the table in front of her sat an envelope. It had arrived 3 days earlier, no return address, an Atlanta postmark. Her name on the front, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. She had picked it up and set it back down twice without opening it, the way you delay something when some part of you already knows what's inside and isn't ready to be changed by it. She reached for it now. Inside was a single item, a receipt. Old, soft at the folds, the kind of paper that's been kept with care. It was from a small flower shop attached to a gas station on Old National Highway in College Park. The date printed on it was from the first year they were married. She turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, that patient, deliberate handwriting she had watched sign the divorce papers without a single tremor, were 2 lines. She read them once. Then she read them again. This was never about what I could give you. It was about who I was when I gave it. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. Bliss sat there for a long time, and then, for the first time in longer than she could measure, she cried. Not the controlled kind, not the kind held carefully behind a composed expression in a courthouse hallway. The kind that comes when nothing's left intact enough to hold anything back. Quietly. Completely. Her hands flat on the table, the gas station receipt in front of her, the cold tea and the children's books, and the whole ordinary weight of the life she was slowly, painfully building in the aftermath of the life she had thrown away. She finally understood. All of it, at once. The way understanding sometimes arrives, not gradually, but in a single, irreversible flood. He had known from the very beginning. Not suspected, known. He had built a folder with her name on it months before she ever served him those papers. He had arranged for her mother's medical expenses and her brother's scholarship before the ink on the divorce papers had even dried. He had expanded that scholarship to cover Jordan's graduate studies without telling anyone. He had driven to Delmar Lane and sat with Celestine over tea and talked about a magnolia tree, then gone back to his office on Peachtree Center Avenue without a word. He had done all of it in silence, without announcement, without any expectation that she would ever know. She hadn't just lost a wealthy husband, she had lost a man who chose, over and over, to be a specific kind of person, and never once let what she was doing to him revise that choice. A man whose character didn't shift depending on who was watching or what was being done to him in private. A man who had decided, long before she handed him those papers, what his integrity was worth, and had refused to sell it, even at the cost of his own marriage. She had handed that man divorce papers while she was still wearing his ring. This story teaches us something no amount of money can buy and no legal settlement can restore. It teaches us that the most dangerous thing we can do in love, or in any relationship built on trust, is to measure a person's worth by what we can see rather than who they are. Bliss had a man who knew the truth about her and chose to protect her anyway. Who knew the full story of her betrayal and still made sure her mother had her medication. Who prepared for every contingency and still led with forgiveness. She didn't lose him because he wasn't enough. She lost him because fear and ambition and the relentless, exhausting pressure of comparison convinced her that what she already held in her hands wasn't what she actually needed, until it was gone. And the silence it left behind was louder than anything Buckhead had ever offered her. For those of us who have spent decades in long marriages, who have watched the men in our lives be overlooked and underestimated, measured by the wrong things, found wanting by standards that were never fair to begin with, this story holds something worth keeping. Quiet strength is still strength. Patience is not weakness. And a man who does the right thing when no one is watching, when there's no audience and no applause and no recognition of any kind, that man is never truly diminished, even when the world has mistaken his silence for an absence of power. The truth, as it turned out, had been keeping very careful records all along. And some losses, the ones we bring on ourselves through pride and short-sightedness, through the failure to truly see what's been standing in front of us the whole time, those losses become the final teacher. What is genuinely valuable rarely announces itself. These are authentic human stories shaped by real pain and real dreams. AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure, but the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. These are authentic human stories, Shaped by real pain and real dreams, AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure. But the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Wynn. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Wynn. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.